Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to take part in this incredibly important debate, and of course to see so many on the front bench in stark contrast to earlier on today when the Conservatives were seeking to defend their Prime Minister, or not, as it so happens. But this is an incredibly important debate, and that being the case, I for one am a little bit surprised about the content of the debate so far. I think we heard from the Minister that the Government have done everything that they possibly can throughout the pandemic to assist businesses, but of course what the Minister didn't say, in fact what the Shadow Minister didn't seem to reflect upon either, is the fact that during the height of that pandemic, what the UK Government chose to do was to leave the world's biggest single market. And what we've not talked about or heard about at any point in the debate so far is the impact of Brexit upon businesses in Scotland and right up and down the United Kingdom. It is a proverbial elephant in this chamber. Because all of us, every single one of us, will have businesses in our constituencies who are facing challenges. And the vast bulk of those challenges emanate from Brexit. Now, we all know the headline OBR figures in terms of the 4% hit to the UK's economy. We all know about the trade deficits that we've seen, the impact that we've seen upon exports and imports, the problems that we've seen with labour shortages. But the reality is that whilst the member shakes his head, but it's the reality of the situation. Does he want to? Oh, I'm more than happily give way to him.
To point out to the House that this country's trade deficit in the last few months has narrowed, not widened, as he's just said.
I was hoping the member was going to rise to his feet and defend Brexit, Mr Deputy Speaker, but unfortunately he chose not to, and he chose not to do so because the reality is that it cannot be defended. It cannot be fixed, as the Labour Party seem to think that it possibly can. And when you look at businesses in my constituency, and I go and talk to them quite regularly, and you hear the challenges that they face, so you'll go and speak to them, and goods that took a couple of days to ship to the continent now take a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months. The order book is not there. The impact is huge. Their ability to grow has been constrained. What does the government offer in exchange for that? They tell them they could perhaps have a trade deal with Australia instead, where the fraction of good that will do in comparison to the damage being done by leaving the European Union. And that's, of course, before we get on to the labour shortages that I mentioned earlier, because the labour shortages are enormous. Businesses seeking to function, businesses seeking to grow, who simply cannot get the employees that they were able to get before. And we do see some puzzled faces on the members opposite. Perhaps that puzzlement's because they've not been engaging with the hospitality sector. Would the member like to clarify whether she's disagreeing with the fact that businesses have difficulties in terms of labour shortages or not? I'll happily give way to her. No, of course not, because the reality is that labour shortages are damaging businesses and damaging them exponentially. She continues to shake her head, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it's the reality on the ground, whether that's in hospitality, whether that's in food processing, whether that's in agriculture, right across the board. And that's before we even get into the public sector challenges in our care homes and our hospitals in terms of trying to recruit staff. So Brexit should be at the forefront of the debate here today. And frankly, I am a little bit disappointed in the Labour Party and the fact that they seem to try and walk away from it. But notwithstanding that fact, I think a lot of the motion that's been put forward by the Labour Party is somewhat difficult to disagree with. The topics that they're seeking to raise, business rates for instance, I think all of us across the chamber realise that there's challenges in relation to business rates. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. Where I do have some concerns in relation to the Labour Party's proposals, albeit not necessarily within the motion, is what comes next. What do they want to replace it with? Now, from a local authority background myself, I know the huge role that business rates play within the funding of local authorities, and unless you can say this is what we're going to replace it with, it's inevitable that the public are going to look at that and say, well, where is the detail? And without seeking to do the Conservative Party's job for them, I think it is a fair question to ask, and it's one that the Labour Party are going to have to answer in due course. But when it comes to business rates, in Scotland we've done things slightly different from the UK Government. Because, of course, in Scotland at this moment in time there is 100% rates relief for retail and hospitality, which doesn't exist in England at this moment in time. And that is a phenomenal benefit to businesses, irrespective of what the chuntering member is saying opposite. But beyond business rates, as important as that is, the energy situation at this moment in time is, of course, of great concern to businesses right up and down this United Kingdom. And we don't appear to have any solutions from the government in respect of that. The easier choice today would have been, of course, to back the motion earlier on in relation to VAT. But as far as I see it at this moment in time, we've not seen anything from the government in terms of offering support to businesses when it comes to their energy costs. So that is a wrong that needs to be righted as soon as possible. Otherwise, businesses are going to have an unenviable position going forward, not just households, but businesses themselves.
Is that a good way?
Sure, yeah, I'm quite happy to give way to the member.
I wonder if the member would agree with me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that where you have a family, and I can think of examples I know personally, whereby the budgeting is so tight, there's just £1 or £2 either way before you're into a bad situation, that if the fuel bill goes up or the diesel bill goes up for the car, they spend less money shopping, and that in turn hits wee businesses in Aberdeen South or in the Highlands or whatever, and it's a vicious spiral in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Absolutely. My honourable friend has made an excellent point, and that is the knock-on impact that the economy will face as a result of the crisis that is before us. But of course, before I finish, I just want to reflect on two further points. I'm more than happy to give way to the member opposite, as always.
I ran a business in Scotland. I would want to know what he's going to do in the future, because the rate of growth, economic growth in Scotland between 2013 and 2019, pre-pandemic, was 1.2% annual growth versus the rest of the UK, 2%. That is bad for business. What is he going to do in Scotland to grow the economy at a more rapid rate, even to the rate of the rest of the United Kingdom?
Market. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, moving on, in terms of the two biggest issues that are outstanding that I have not touched upon, the pandemic, of course, is an enormous challenge that is still with us, and we need to be cognizant of that as we move forward. But when we have those discussions, when we reflect upon the challenge faced by the pandemic, we can't do so without forgetting the fact that there are still businesses up and down this land who have not had support from the government throughout the entire pandemic, those within the excluded. I spoke to one earlier today, Pulsate in Aberdeen, an innovative company who are trying to do remarkable things working alongside some of the biggest players in the North Sea oil and gas sector who've not had the support that they feel they needed from the UK government. I think that's deeply regrettable, and we shouldn't have a discussion about businesses without remembering that important fact. And that takes me on quite nicely to my final point, which is in relation to perhaps one of the biggest sectors in Scotland that needs support from this UK government, and that is our renewables sector. Scotland has 25% of Europe's offshore wind capacity. Scotland can be a world leader in renewable technologies. But as I said earlier, and as I'm sure the Minister heard earlier today, Scotland still faces the highest level of grid charging in the entirety of Europe. The entirety of Europe. We have a natural resource on our shores that and off our shores that we should be exploiting, that this UK government is putting barriers to business in terms of capitalising upon that. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, I think it's important to reflect upon the fact that much of what I've spoken about is a reflection upon the failures of this UK government. And when we look at it from a Scottish perspective, certainly when I look at it from my perspective, I see the shortcomings of this UK government, and I see what more Scotland can do with the full powers of an independent nation.